Well, hello. My name is Paul Mills. I'm a professor of family medicine and public health at the University of California, San Diego. It's my great pleasure today to be here with Dr. Dave Schubert, who's a professor and head of the Cellular Neurobiology Laboratory at the Salk Institute here in La Jolla, California. Your main research area is in work on drug discovery, primarily for Alzheimer's disease and also Parkinson's disease. But you also moved into the fray of the very controversial world of genetically modified foods, as well as the herbicides that are sprayed on those GM foods. And that's primarily the herbicide Roundup, which is used to kill the weeds as the GM plants are growing. And there's the primary ingredient of Roundup called glyphosate. So it's great to have you here to get your knowledge in this area. And I think our conversation is particularly relevant because, as you know, a Superior Court judge granted the state of California the right to begin to list glyphosate, that main ingredient of the genetically modified food herbicides, as a carcinogen, adversely impacting human health. So I'd like to begin by asking, how did you, as an academic neuroscientist, move into the world of GM foods?
Well, I have to admit it was something of an accident. I was on a San Diego County group called the Science Advisory Board for San Diego County, and this was a group of scientists. There was sort of a mixture of engineers, basic science, academic scientists, clinical people, and their mission was to advise the Board of Supervisors on science-based issues for the county. And these issues included things like fluoridation, runoff, fire control, things like that. And I said, being a biologist on the group, I was asked at one point to write a white paper, which is usually the way it worked. The panel would get some information, then discuss things, get some witnesses to see what was going on, and then produce a short one-page white paper on, advice to the supervisors exactly what to do. And sometimes they paid attention, sometimes not. And so what happened was a company had wanted to grow genetically modified rice in San Diego County, which produced a protein that was intended for medicinal use. And this was in 2000, around 2000, 2002. So it was at the early stages of the GM production and the use of this in agriculture to a large extent, certainly one of the early events in medicine. So I wrote something up on this. I had some concerns. It was related to what I had worked on in the laboratory. And this was written up, and then it got, I'm still not clear exactly how, I think to Dick Stroman, who was a professor at UC Berkeley. And then I think he sent it to Andrew Marshall, who was the editor of Nature Biotechnology, which is a high-end biotechnology journal. And he was interested, and he asked me to submit a paper on this. And so this paper was very straightforward. I just listed some of the concerns I had about the GM technology. And what really got me into this whole field, I have to say, is the response to that paper, which was there was a letter immediately following the paper. 17 scientists signed on to that, including a number of them at my own institution. And the basis of the content of that letter was basically, a lot of it was just simply not true. And so I found that very difficult to believe that academic people would actually sign on to something that they knew fundamentally was not true. There were things like they could. So my argument were threefold, that proteins in plants get changed modified differently than in animal cells. So it's going to be very difficult to make a protein in plants that work in animal cells without being immunogenic. And I'd worked on that, my PhD thesis, something similar. And another argument was, you're going to create mutations, you can't really control that. And the third argument was something about the secondary metabolism of plants. You're not going to get products that out as far as small molecules, something else we work on. And so the idea that these people would write something like that and sign it and publish it and basically try to make me look extremely incompetent and bad, when in fact everything I wrote turned out to be valid, and it is still valid. And so that sort of led me to get into this in a curiosity way why they would do that, and try to understand, the motivation and sort of the background of this whole thing. And that was the reason that I actually got into this.
So, as you know, when the GM crops are first created and to have approval to go to market, there's this concept of substantial equivalence, meaning that the crop itself is basically safe, much as the isogenic version. And you were just mentioning how these proteins, they'll change characteristics going, say, from plant to animal. So can you comment on this concept of substantial equivalence, particularly in light of the recent paper in Scientific Reports last year, looking at the NK603 and some of the multi-omics characteristics of that seed?
So the idea is quite simple, actually, in the sense that the argument made at that point was that, if a corn is modified by genetically modifying its content by expressing a protein or whatever, that this is something which is, in a global sense, very similar to what is normally occurring. But I think it's important to sort of understand the context of that and how these plants are modified. So there are three agencies within the government which deal with GM plants. There's the Department of Agriculture, which basically has nothing to do with the safety or anything like that, but it controls where these plants can be tested and the distribution and whatever. EPA is the other group, and they're responsible for testing pesticides and chemicals, and in the sense that like Bt toxin is in fact a pesticide, so Bt toxin expressing plants would be tested by the EPA. And it's important to understand also that the EPA does not do the testing itself. The testing is done outside of the government. It's sponsored by the producer, and there's been a lot of controversy recently about whether this is done honestly or not. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's quite clear that a lot of this stuff is bogus. It's the way the testing has been done. And then the third group is the FDA. And the FDA, when this process was set up, how to regulate the GM food, the FDA was sort of a main focus of this. And the FDA does two things, legally is responsible for two things, major things. One is drugs, testing drugs. We have drugs in the process, the FDA approval process, so I know something about that. And the other is food additives. And so with food additives, basically are tested very similar to drugs in the sense they go through a fairly rigorous testing protocol. But part of that food additive testing is they don't do everything, and there's something called generally recognized as safe, is GRAS designation. And so this designation is that, if you look at the product and it's very similar to something that's out there and there's no scientific evidence that it's different, then it can get approval without going through the animal testing and so on. And so when the regulation for GM products was set up, the idea was to get this illusion that these products go through the FDA, but in fact without any testing. So the way they did it was they designated GM plants as a GRAS product. I mean, it's generally recognized as safe, and therefore it requires no safety testing. So people have got to understand that there is no mandatory safety testing of any GM crop. And in fact, there's never been any, as far as I know, the FDA has never required any safety testing of any product. And so this GRAS designation then evolved into this substantially equivalent thing. And that was more of an international consensus on how the terminology used when this GRAS determination was used in Europe and other places. So the paper that you mentioned just disproved this argument, which everybody had known actually for a long time. There are lots of other papers on this, that these plants which are genetically modified are not the same as the parent compound. So what Antonu and his colleagues did was look at the molecular profile of the GM corn plant versus the isogenic plant and showed that it was really quite different.
Substantial differences.
Substantially different. And this is true with essentially all of these plants.
Okay. Another important topic, I think, with the original rationale for creating GM plants in the first place was that they would result in much greater yields. And with the idea that we need more yield because we have a growing population on the planet. And also accompanying that argument was the idea that over time we'd need less and less herbicides to be sprayed on the plants, so presumably the crops and food would be healthier for us to eat. Can you comment on this idea? How is that panned out?
Well, it's panned out very poorly for the argument in the sense that there's no evidence for increased yield, and there's no the amount of herbicides or pesticides in general has increased enormously since the introduction of GM plants, and so there can be no argument about that. The glyphosate-based herbicides have gone up at least tenfold in the last 10 or 15 years. And a lot of the other plants require additional pesticides because the pests are becoming resistant. And so the total amount of pesticide use in the world has gone up enormously. And so there may be, initially when some of these plants like BT toxin expressing cotton, for example, are introduced, there's a reduction in pesticide for a short period of time. This happened in China and India and other places here too. But then over time the insects become resistant and you have to start all over again, basically.
Can I ask a question on that? I mean, wasn't that anticipated? Because we all are, I think, admirers of the ingenuity and the adaptability of nature. So we would expect over time plants to become more resistant, and then we'd either need more of that product or we'd need to create another product to use on the plants.
So this is certainly true with the herbicides. Obviously, the herbicide-resistant plants are becoming very abundant. They're a major problem. It's driving this sort of war of chemical biology versus the plant. It's now requiring the introduction of new herbicides, which have been used in a minor scale before, are much less so than required now for the production of GM plants, things like dicambra and 2,4-D and whatever. So that's a
Those are being rolled out now? They're
being rolled out now. They're marginally, the plants, I'm not sure exactly what the status of the plants are, but I know they're in production and whether they're used extensively or not, but that's the next line of GM plants because of the herbicide resistant in the context of Roundup and glyphosate.
Is 2,4-D, or is it the other one that's already considered a carcinogenic agent?
Well, both of them are. I mean, the dicambra and 2,4-D, and 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange, and there are studies out there. They're quite clear that these things are very toxic, and so this is one of the I like to say there are 6 myths which are always propagated by the pro-GM people. This idea that the increased yield is one myth that's just not true, and the other myth is that these products have been proven safe, and so safety is an issue that, in the context of public health, that's how I got into this whole discussion anyway, is the context of public health. And so this is really a public health issue, and this statement that these GM products are safe is just totally absurd and proven safe. I mean, let's put it that way. So, I mean, there are a large number of reasons for this. I mean, one, you can't prove safety. I mean, so in the context of drug discovery, as we know, that you can prove harm, you can suggest harm, but it's really difficult to prove safety. So that's why when you do a drug development, you have to go through a series of animal protocols to show toxicity. You have to show no toxicity at a certain level before you can expose people to it, these drugs. And that's the first step in both the FDA approval process for drugs and for food additives also, which is where the GM plant should be. And so So the safety issue, there's no epidemiology. How do you know so the argument is people have been eating this for years and there's no evidence of harm, but how do you know that? So the other thing is one of the recent talking points of the GM industry is that there's a scientific consensus about this and that these products are safe. And how can you have a consensus when they're all different? So these products each one is different. Each individual GM product is different. And we don't know what they are going to be in the future. So there's a whole series of both new technology making GM plants, and then there's also new types of plants, like these nutritionally enhanced plants or something new where they put vitamins and healthy type components in plants. So there's just no way to make this statement that these things are there's a consensus and they're safe. And then the argument necessary to feed the world, as you're aware, there's been several statements from the World Health Organization and many other groups saying that this is just not the case. And there are two other arguments. One is just like normal breeding. I mean, it's just
normal breeding, plant breeding, yes.
Plant breeding where it's been done for 10,000 years. It's the same type of process, and it's just totally ridiculous. And so then the last argument is it's less damaging to the environment. So this has taken quite a while to disprove, but it's quite clear now with the problems with the butterflies and this destruction of the soil and so on. It's just not the case.
I have seen some recent papers on the topic of the soil and changes in the microbiome of the soil, et cetera. So this is also a good segue for my next question, moving on to the herbicides for the soil, which you mentioned. And I mentioned that the introduction, this Superior Court judge just ruled the state of California can list glyphosate as a carcinogenic agent. And there was a paper published in 2015, the Journal of Biological Physics and Chemistry, which basically provides a large review of the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate, providing a review of many of the different biochemical pathways of which it might be acting to actually support the onset of cancer. And I found interesting in that paper, they cited several documents that they had obtained from a company that creates Roundup in the GM crops, Monsanto, that they had received through the Freedom of Information Act, suggesting that some of the early research, Monsanto's own research, was indicating these pathways also being activated. But these were never really brought forth at that time or subsequent for the public or for the research community to utilize in our own research to study and test these products. Can you comment on what you know about that paper and the
I know that there's been some press recently about this. There's an ongoing lawsuit by a number of people who have got Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they're suing Monsanto, I believe, but because they believe that the Roundup was the cause of it. And so there's clearly was some collusion between the EPA and the safety testing, and we know a lot of the claims now with like the stability of glyphosate in soil and water, they're just not true.
One of the things I particularly wanted to cover that some of our viewers might not be aware of is that yes, these herbicides are sprayed on the genetically modified crops, primarily corn and soy, the vast majority of which are GM crops grown here in the U.S. But the herbicide Roundup is also sprayed on some non-GM crops. For example, much of the wheat grown in the U.S., maybe 80–85% from what I've read. So many people might know that. They might be avoiding a GM crop thinking they're going organic, but in fact they're not. They'll still be exposed to the Roundup and the glyphosate. Why are these non-GM crops sprayed with these products?
No, the reason's quite clear. It increases a little bit the safety margin for farmers. So the idea is to kill the crop more rapidly. Normally a grain crop you would after it seeds, you let the crop dry out before you harvest it, and this takes a few weeks or some finite period of time. And if you can kill the crop very rapidly with Roundup or other herbicides, then this speeds up the process and it reduces the risk of rain and mold and this type of thing. So, so it's obviously not necessary. We've had 10,000 years of agriculture without this, but they found this is another way. I mean, the main goal of these companies is to sell their poisons, right? And this is the history of most of these biotech companies that produce the seeds is they're chemical companies, and the idea is to sell these chemicals. So this was another way to do it. And what surprising to me when I talk to people, most people are not aware of this. And so essentially any grain crop that's not only here but in Europe and other places, and things like sugarcane, South America, Central America, these crops are sprayed before harvest with Roundup or something similar to kill them. And this is certainly at the present time the highest source of exposure to glyphosate. So as you're aware, I mean, you can now measure glyphosate in your urine. It's in the foods. People are starting to publicize this. There's information out there. It was basically difficult, and there's somewhat, people didn't. There was a lot of social pressure not to publicize this. But now that there's public access to being able to get your urine measured, people are realizing it. Essentially, there's this massive contamination of humanity, at least in the Europe and the United States. Essentially, everybody has got this in their blood, in their body at quite high levels, and that's much less, about tenfold less in Europe and the United States. But even, like myself, I had myself tested, and I have like a fourfold over the European limit that's in their drinking water, like 0.4 parts per billion, which is tenfold lower than the U.S. thing. So basically, everybody has this in their system, and it's probably the most massive chemical contamination of the human population ever. I would say much worse than DDT or any of these other things. So the question is whether that's relevant or not. And this has been the big issue, in this debate, is whether these low levels of glyphosate which have been shown to be toxic and probable carcinogenic, whether these lower levels are significant. And I think that another paper by Michael Antonou, his English scientist, shows that this is in fact the case, because he looked at rats which are exposed to very low levels of Roundup, and these rats developed a fatty liver disease, which is a precursor to liver cancer. Yes. And if you look at the American population, about 50% of these of Americans have this non-alcoholic form of fatty liver disease. And and this has increased recently along with liver cancer the last 20 years, and it's much higher in this areas in the United States where they do a lot of farming.
That's very interesting.
But what's interesting from a scientific point of view, so when science, you like to know the end result of the observation, whether a drug works or not, but you like to know how it works. And so what was really nice about this Michael's study, and it was followed up by something which he didn't know about, from what I understand, another study where they actually found the molecular target for for glyphosate. And this target turned out to be an enzyme in liver that breaks down fat. So this glyphosate inhibits this enzyme, and that produces accumulation of fat in the liver of these animals. And so you have an observation of a toxicity, you have the molecular mechanism, and it seems to me this would be an extremely strong argument about the toxicity of glyphosate.
I also want to note for the viewers that there are some papers out there, and perhaps you've seen them, that for those who are concerned about glyphosate levels in their body, there are papers showing that if you switch to an organically based diet, then there is a washout of glyphosate out of your system, at least being detectable in urine within, say, a week or two.
That's right.
There haven't been papers yet showing how it might or might not be washed out of tissues where glyphosate is also routinely stored for long periods of time. hopefully there'll be some research on that we could begin to learn and understand. I'd like to close then. Could you comment briefly on this topic of how the industry has utilized some Nobel Prize winners to disseminate certain viewpoints on the glyphosate and perhaps the GM crops in general?
Last spring there was a major concern of the GM industry in the sense that a couple of states had passed labeling laws, and so they wanted to try to stop that because they had this perception that if you label food as GM, people aren't going to buy it. And that perception I don't think was necessarily true, but because people in Europe have been buying GM containing products labeled as such for years, and they don't pay much attention. And so anyway, so they tried to stop this, and so one way they could do it was through legislation. And so they introduced a series of laws into Congress to basically to limit or to stop this labeling. And so in conjunction with that, they had a big PR campaign to convince the politicians that that GM is safe and there's no need for labeling, whatever. But anyway, so what they did was they organized a PR campaign based on Nobel Prize winners. And what they did was to get them to sign on to this precision agriculture, which makes sense. If you're a scientist, you don't know much about it, you're for science. And, or even if you're not a scientist, a lot of these Nobel Prize winners that signed on to this were not scientists. It's perfectly reasonable. If I didn't know anything about the system, that was
strategy.
Personally okay. So what they did is they got about over 100 Nobel Prize winners to basically sign this letter, and then they did a big rollout of this at a press conference in Washington D.C. Invited the newspapers, and so this occurred just a few weeks before the ultimate decision was to be made about this act, about the Food Labeling Act, which had been going through Congress very slowly, been modified, and it ended up being modified totally to Monsanto's and the company's wishes. I mean, it was a perfect thing for them.
Well, that's very interesting about this food labeling campaign that utilized a lot of Nobel Prize scientists, and from what I understand, that bill did pass. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. It did pass. Obama signed it,
Obama signed it, yes.
Very depressing for me because it was something that was essentially written to placate the GM industry, and it gave them a lot of changes in the way that the GM policy is regulated in the government, and it just was perfect for them, but it was really bad for the consumer.
Dave, I want to thank you so much for your time today. It's been very interesting and I think important, particularly for our viewers of the UCTV Wellbeing channel, because this is such a highly relevant and controversial area for health, and our viewers and others need to be informed on this topic. So thank you for your time today.
Pleasure to do it. I hope I got some ideas across.
You did indeed. Thank you.